Welcome to the 12th year of the Will Miller Social Justice Lecture Series. I'm very pleased that we're able to bring Professor Taylor to Burlington to speak to us on the topic of Black Lives Matter in the Trump era. This lecture series was created in honor of Will Miller, my late husband, who was a social justice activist and University of Vermont philosophy professor, who died in March 2005. As our logo states, he will always be remembered as a clear voice in a world of false words and disinformation. How I wish he was here now, as obviously you guys do too. We could use his energy, his intellect, his insights, and his imagination. For example, some of you may remember that it was Will's suggestion at an anti-apartheid organizing meeting that students create a mock shantytown on the Green to raise awareness about the need for the university to divest from companies doing business in South Africa. That night, building materials arrived on campus, structures were built, a community was formed, and an alternative learning environment was created. This lecture series brings speakers to the Burlington community and the UVM campus to provide a radical analysis of social, ecological, and political concerns. Will set a courageous example in speaking truth to power. He showed boundless optimism and a passion for the truth. His voice was powerful, especially in encouraging others, students, staff, faculty, community members, and people from around the world to speak up and be heard. He showed a personal strength and an unwavering commitment to the struggle against war and for social justice, and helped to move others into activism. He was never afraid to speak his mind, put words into action, or place himself on the line, whether before the university trustees, on a picket line, at a barricade, or in a congressional office. Will offered reasoned and insightful analyses into the origins and workings of capitalism and imperialism, giving us a call to struggle and a vision of a more just society. He advocated for a society where all work is valued, where truth is not silenced but is nurtured, where all are treated as equals, that is at peace with itself, and where people and resources are not exploited. UVM should not only be a place where students and faculty learn about struggles for social justice, but it should also be a place where students, faculty, and staff continue to struggle against the racist legacies of eugenics and cakewalk. Will devoted his life as a professor to these struggles, including the struggle to end the university's investment in apartheid South Africa, the struggle to finally join the 20th century in creating programs and courses in U.S. ethnic and women's studies, and the struggle to win a union for faculty and other campus workers. As these and similar struggles continue, I encourage students during the Q&A time to share their current work in pressing the administration to divest from corporations profiting from the Dakota Access Pipeline and other activism. I have two requests from United Academics, the Union of UVM Faculty, which is a co-sponsor of this event. First, the directors of Critical Race and Ethnic Studies and of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, Ginny Hugh and Tina Eskaha, are interested in talking after this lecture with anyone who was part of the campus struggles in the late 80s and 90s, which finally won the creation of ethnic and women's studies programs at UVM. University administrations depend on historical amnesia, a current generation of faculty and students who don't know their history. Professors Hugh and Eskaha would like to talk with and learn from those of you who, like Will, were part of this important social justice history at UVM. Tina and Ginny, would you stand so people can see who you are and know who to connect with? Thanks for doing this. It's awesome. Secondly, UVM faculty invite you to sign up on the circulating clipboards so that they can stay in touch with you about the struggle for a fair and equitable contract for faculty, one that values education and research over marketing and branding. We could not bring you these lectures without the generous support from members of our community. Thank you to those of you who have sent in donations. We also have containers at our table over near the door for you to drop in a donation if you so desire. No donation is too small. We get information out about our lectures through snail mail, email, social media. We encourage you to connect with us on Facebook and share your email with us on our clipboards. There are 2 sets of clipboards going around. Ours look like this with the pen that is attached. If you would like to learn more about Will and the work that he did, we suggest that you look at our webpage, which is www.willmiller.org. Who knew he would become a .org? Many campus and off-campus groups and departments have given financial support and sponsorship to this lecture. There are tables in the back of the room where you can find more information about the work these groups are doing locally. I would like to thank the Black Student Union, Center for Cultural Pluralism, college undergraduates not tolerating sexism, critical race and ethnic studies, the English, geography, and history departments, gender, sexuality, and women's studies, honors college, International Socialist Organization, Justice for Queer and Trans Students, Women of Color Coalition, Black Lives Matter Vermont, Black Rose, Rosa Negra Burlington, Global Justice Ecology Project, Haymarket Books, and Will Miller Green Mountain Veterans for Peace chapter. I'd also like to thank CCTV, which records all of our events and rebroadcasts them on Channel 17 and through their website, so that our lectures continue to be available beyond the date that they happen. Haymarket Books, another major sponsor of this event, is also a sponsor of the annual Socialism Conference. Socialism 2017, Build the Left, Fight the Right, is a 4-day conference that will bring together hundreds of socialists and radical activists from around the country, including Keeanga, to take part in discussions about Marxism, working class history, and the debates and strategies for organizing today. You can find more information about this conference at the Haymarket Books table at the back of the room. If you haven't already, somebody just waved to show you where it is, in case you want to look. If you haven't already purchased Keeanga's book, after the Q&A period, you may purchase a copy and she'll be available for signing. Now, I would like to introduce you to Angie Crespo, a current UVM student who will introduce Professor Taylor. Angie has been a leader of and participated in numerous social justice organizations. In her role as a founder and logistics chair of UVM's Women of Color Coalition, she was asked to introduce Keeanga. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well today. So as a woman of color on UVM's campus and a Bronx, New York native, learning and knowing the ways that our institutions and systems fail people of color is crucial for moving forward. Due to technology, the public eye has been able to witness atrocities such as Trayvon Martin, Eric Gardner, Tamir Rice, Philando Castro, Sandra Bland, and more. The Black Lives Matter movement is a cry for help and a call to action. Created by Black queer women who opened up this platform to give voice to the voiceless. The Black Lives Matter movement has erupted this new level of wokeness, where we call out cultural appropriation, microaggressions, privilege, and more, where we do not stay silent when they pimp a butterfly, where you cannot tell us to pick ourselves up from our bootstraps to create a better life, and where even in the face of injustice, like air, we rise. As I previously mentioned, I'm from the Bronx, where racism is covert. I was never told how to protest police brutality, but rather how to shrink and silence myself in order to protect myself. It wasn't until coming to Vermont that I realized how racism is the very foundation of this country and the foundation of how people perceive my peers and me. Keeanga's presence on this campus today is affirming for faculty, staff, and students of color. Intersectionality is the intertwining systems of oppression or disadvantage. Viola Davis once said, the only thing that separates women of color from everybody else is opportunity. Whether it be opportunities to loans, housing, environmental rights, reproductive rights, education, healthcare, or simply life, women of color and people of color have been fighting for equity for centuries against white supremacy, patriarchy, racism, capitalism, and more. I'm so proud and honored to introduce Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, who is a beautiful Black woman, author, assistant professor in the African American Studies Department at Princeton University, and so much more. My name is Angelica Crespo, or Angie, and I'm the logistics chair of the Women of Color Coalition. Please check out our table in the back, and without further ado, I would like to introduce Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. Thank you.
Hello. I'd like to thank Angie and thank the sponsoring organizations for inviting me here to give a talk. Now, when I initially agreed to do this talk, the world was very different. And so I would be derelict in my duty to not actually take up current events. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. Hopefully it'll make sense. I offer these talks in the spirit of provocation. And so, I encourage people in the Q&A, to ask questions, to say what you think, to disagree, and to really participate in the spirit of collectively trying to figure out how do we move forward in this increasingly frightening society. And so with that, let's get started. Just over 8 years ago, when Barack Obama became president of the United States, the national conversation in the country was whether or not the US was going to become a post-racial society. Indeed, in December of 2008, Forbes magazine ran an exuberant editorial that claimed, quote, "Racism in America is over." But slightly more than 8 long years later, we could not be further from that conversation. Not only is racism not over in the United States, but an unabashed racist sits at its helm. Give it up for racism. Donald Trump ran a campaign fueled on racism, anti-Muslim bigotry, sexism, and rabid nationalism. It is not hyperbole to say that white supremacy sits at the heart of the American government. Donald Trump chose as his chief strategist Steve Bannon, the former editor of the race-baiting, hate-mongering Breitbart News. Bannon once bragged that Breitbart was a platform for the so-called alt-right, which is nothing other than a new name for white supremacists. There is also Stephen Miller, who was the architect of the Muslim travel ban and who at one point was a protege of expressed white supremacist Richard Spencer when both were at Duke University. More important then, the campaign promises of a bigot and a sexual predator have been brought to life in Trump's rise to the presidency. And despite the so-called populist rhetoric of Trump during the campaign, his cabinet choices, an array of billionaires, campaign donors, and wholly unqualified individuals, betray an agenda intended to gut the living standards of ordinary and working class people across this country while continuing to line the pockets of the rich. Whatever fragile remnants of government and social welfare intended to protect the public from the ravages of the free market status quo will be shredded. Trump has put a fox in every henhouse with regards to the individuals he has chosen to oversee posts in the Environmental Protection Agency, in the Department of Labor, in the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the Department of Education. All are populated by individuals who have either profited from the unequal distribution of wealth in this society or from the frequent crises unleashed by the imbalance of power in this society. Individuals who question the very necessity of the agencies that they have been tasked with overseeing, creating a recipe for either inaction or ineptitude. The righteous fear of Trump and the budding resistance to his dangerous administration should not, however, obscure the very important discussion of how we got here and how this happened in the first place. Many media narratives have tried to make sense of the apparent contradiction of high approval ratings for former President Barack Obama and the electoral victory of Donald Trump. As incongruent as it may seem, in fact, the two are connected. As wholly opposite in demeanor, aptitude, and temperament as Barack Obama and Donald Trump are, we cannot actually understand the rise of Trump without taking account of the failure of Obama to deliver on his promises of hope and change. Embedded inside of every right-wing backlash is the failure of the liberal establishment to provide a better way. The media narrative locating Trump's rise solely in his ability to connect with the dispossessed so-called white working class is incomplete at best and disingenuous and exaggerated at worst. Most Trump supporters had a median income of $72,000 a year compared to the $55,000 median income for most white people. Of voters making $50,000 or less, most of them voted for Clinton. Trump's rise is actually a story about who did not vote more than who did vote. In fact, Trump won with fewer voters than Republican candidate Mitt Romney in 2012. So to begin with, tens of millions of Americans did not bother to vote at all. There are 238 million eligible voters in the United States, and of that number, only 60 million of them voted for Trump. And even among them, 5% said that he was unfit to be president. The real story of the 2016 presidential election is that literally tens of millions of voters decided not to vote at all. The media and other political operatives describe this decision not to vote as apathy. It is an easy description that requires little thought or analysis of the problem within electoral politics that creates so little confidence and so much indifference, even when it appears that so much is at stake. And one need look no further than the Democratic Party to fully understand the scope of the problem. Since the shock of the election, the Democrats have blamed their losses on Fox News, on bad messaging, on the FBI, on emails, and of course, on the Russians. But there is virtually no reckoning with the political shortcomings of the party. There is no reckoning with how this party that purports to be a party of the people consistently fails to deliver actual change for the ordinary people it claims to represent. For example, the presidency of Barack Obama is deemed a success simply because of the absence of any real scandal that marred his presidency. The so-called success of the Obama administration is a lesson in how the performance and appearance of civility often passes as political accomplishment or legitimacy in this country. But while Obama could be complimented for his good manners and wholesome disposition, And even while taking into account the historic significance of his presidency as an African American in a country founded on slavery and where Jim Crow was the law of the land until 2 generations ago, those facts should not blind us to other facts. Chief among the other facts were Obama's inability to challenge the political and economic status quo for millions of people in this country. For the political and economic elite, including the leadership of the Democratic Party, the absence of scandal or catastrophe registers as success. Because this was not like the administration of George W. Bush, which took the country into an illegal and immoral war with the country of Iraq in 2003. This was not Bush crashing the American economy and threatening to take the global economy with it in 2007 and 2008. This was not the Bush administration's collective shrug in the face of the catastrophe of Hurricane Katrina in 2005. However, for millions of people in this country, it is the status quo that is increasingly intolerable. It gnaws away at the tiny threads millions of people are hanging on to as they struggle to make the ends meet every day. For people who pine for the good old days of Obama, or who wistfully long for what could have been with Hillary Clinton as president, it is only because the lives of ordinary people who struggle with the unspectacular and unglamorous crisis of everyday life have been rendered invisible. We live in a celebrity culture that glorifies the rich and the famous while ignoring the quotidian and mundane. Imagine if we had a press, a popular culture, or a political class that was curious about the lives of poor people or working class people. If we did, what would they find? What is the status quo over the last several years? They would find a continuing crisis of opioid addiction in this country. There are 2 million people addicted to opioids in the United States, a disproportionate number of whom are white. Half of those people are addicted to heroin. From 2009 to 2014, almost 500,000 people have died from opioid overdoses, a 4-fold increase since 1999. They would find in the status quo a briefly reported on story in the news about the reported decline in life expectancy for white women. It is unprecedented for life expectancy to reverse in a so-called first world country. In the US's peer countries, life expectancy is growing. Why is life expectancy for white working class women in decline? Drug overdose, suicide, and alcohol abuse. Indeed, a recent study has projected that the United States as a whole will have a life expectancy rate on par with Mexico and Croatia by the year 2030. Already, the United States lags behind all of its peer countries in life expectancy for the entire population. What else is in the status quo over the last several years? The quiet deportation and removal of 2.5 million undocumented people during the tenure of Barack Obama. In 2012 alone, more than 400,000 undocumented individuals, women, children, men, families, were detained, held in private detention centers with few rights recognized by their captors until they were forcibly returned to the countries they had fled. Now, we can all look in horror at the indiscriminate way that the Trump administration has empowered immigration control enforcement agents to swoop into immigrant communities and round people up. But we must acknowledge that Obama's administration greased the wheels to this machinery of injustice a long time ago. In the status quo, we would find in Chicago that there has been the rise in shootings and murders in the city's working class black neighborhoods. In 2016, there were 4,379 people shot and 797 people killed in Chicago. The overwhelming majority of both were African American. The news media's nonsensical explanations for this violence include things like retaliation. But that is only matched by the nonsense offered by elected officials, which includes things like the absence of role models or poor parenting. What is almost never offered as an explanation, or at least part of an answer, is how Chicago has the highest Black unemployment rate of the nation's 5 largest cities, at 25%. That nearly half of Black men aged 20 to 24 in Chicago are neither in school nor employed. That Chicago has the 3rd highest poverty rate of large cities in America, and that it is the most segregated city in the United States. Instead of dealing with the social catastrophe of poverty, unemployed, a destroyed social safety net and public infrastructure, combined with the proliferation of easily obtained guns, the Trump administration and the right wing has used the reality of violence to silence the focus on police abuse and instead shift the conversation to what they refer to as Black-on-Black crime. This is racist nonsense intended to muffle the conversation about racist and abusive police in this country, right at the time that Trump is looking to consolidate and expand the powers of the police. Part of the justification for this expansion of police powers is to paint Black working class communities as out of control jungles, or the inner cities that Donald Trump keeps referring to, that must be tamed. There is no discussion about expanding any number of social programs that could actually attend to the issues of poverty and the problems that arise from it. Instead, it is law and order. If the Black Lives Matter movement has done nothing else, it has exposed to the world what Black America has always known, which is that the police are racist agents of the state who profile, target, harass, abuse, while acting in wholly unjust ways. These abusive approaches to policing have intensified over the last several years because they are a built-in response to a political system that offers little by way of social welfare to respond to social crises. These contradictions, of course, created the conditions for the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2014. Finally, there is the status quo of the shrinking middle class. In the 1970s, 61% of Americans fell into that vague but stable category of middle class. Today, that number has fallen to 50%. It is driven by the growing wealth inequality that exists in this country. In the last year alone, the 1%, the richest people in this country, saw their income rise by 7%. And the 0.1%, the really richest people in this country, saw their income rise by 9%. In general, the richest 20% of households in the United States own 84% of the wealth in this country, while the bottom 40% own less than 1%. The media would have us believe that this is a story primarily about the Rust Belt and disgruntled white workers. In fact, it is also a story about the 240,000 Black homeowners who lost their houses to foreclosures in the last 8 years. It is also about urban school closures and the decimation of employment for Black educators. Thousands of Black teachers have been fired in the last decade. The Occupy Wall Street movement that erupted in the fall of 2011 gave us the popular language to understand this phenomenon, the 1% versus the 99%. There are 400 billionaires in this country. They are the reason why there are 45 million poor people here. You cannot have untold obscene wealth unless you have untold obscene poverty. But economic inequality and racial injustice don't operate on parallel tracks. They reinforce one another. In fact, racism and discrimination are projected loudly from the top to provide an explanation for economic inequality. We are told that undocumented Mexican immigrants are to blame for unemployment. We are told that Black criminals are to blame for poverty. We are told that Muslim terrorists are to blame for shifting billions of dollars from domestic spending to foreign policy. In effect, we are told that the least powerful and least influential among us are the problem, while the millionaires and billionaires who actually run this country are innocent bystanders. That is how racial and economic inequality complement each other and in the end result in more hardship for regular people. 8 years later, when we put these conditions of the status quo that I described together, they tell a complete story of deprivation and desperation that exists all over this country. They tell the story of the millions of people who have been left behind. This is the status quo. This is life in the United States without some spectacular catastrophe. This is the so-called lesser evil. And it's the inability of the political system and the political establishment to change this dynamic and thus deliver actual changes for the better in people's lives that lead them to ignore elections. When people believed that electing Obama would transform this country and their lives, they voted in historic numbers. But with big expectations and big hope invested in Obama came even bigger disappointment when he failed to deliver. It is absolutely true that the Republicans have been obstinate, recalcitrant, and opposed to giving Obama an inch when he was in office. It speaks to the complete dysfunction of our political system. But it is not just the obstinacy of the Republicans that has been the problem. It was also the narrow and limited vision of Obama's political agenda. Hillary Clinton also ignored everyday conditions experienced by regular people. She ran a campaign where her main slogan was, "America's already great." She ran a campaign focused on the abhorrent behavior of Donald Trump instead of articulating how the party could actually transform those conditions. Clinton promised to be a third term of Obama, failing to realize that for millions of voters, 2 terms was enough. In some ways, it's easy to understand why Clinton stuck to this message. The Democratic Party is committed to the economic status quo represented by free market capitalism. They are its champions. They have championed the political ethos of what some refer to as neoliberalism, or the idea that the market is the best way to deliver public services and that competition is what drives efficiency in government. But if the market is predicated on the idea that there are winners and losers, then this, of course, is a terrible way to run a government. It is a terrible way to deliver education, water, housing, food, healthcare, justice, and other vital necessities that any civilization is dependent upon. But most importantly, if this is the root of your political commitment to the market, to neoliberalism, as it is, I would argue, for the Democratic Party, then that in and of itself necessarily limits the range of political change that you can advance in that party. It was impossible for Clinton to argue that her party would deliver change and break the grip of political order that privileges the rich and powerful, when the Democrats have been in power for the last 8 years, supporting policies that have maintained the division between the 1% and the 99%. In other words, we cannot understand the rise of Trump and Trumpism by only looking at what he and the Republicans have done. We must also understand it in terms of what the Democratic Party has not done. Bernie Sanders recognized this. He ran a campaign in the primaries that tapped into the realization that for most ordinary people, things are getting worse. He recognized that it is the responsibility of government to alleviate those pressures through provision. And with no money and almost no name recognition, and with the entire Democratic Party establishment trained against him, he nearly won the party's nomination for president. If you want to understand the depth of suffering in this country, know that 13 million people cast their vote for an open socialist. You have to have some sense of history to understand how unprecedented that was. In the 1950s, this was the country of the Red Scare. This was the country of anti-communism. This is a country that executed two communists for being communists, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, in 1953. The insurgent campaign of Sanders can be read as an indictment of an economic system that has failed over and over and over again to deliver a better way for most people in this country. But when Sanders insists on hitching his wagon to that Democratic Party train, then he undercuts much of the critique he makes because it's a party that embodies the injustice and inequality he rails so passionately against. And why is this history important? Because in 2018, there will be a midterm election. And the Democratic Party is hoping that the presence of Trump alone will be enough to discipline its base into shutting up and turning out to vote while demanding nothing in return. The Democratic Party, of course, believes that it is entitled to our vote while having to do absolutely nothing to earn it. History can be a powerful tool in reminding us how we got to this point, especially when the Democratic Party offers us nothing other than not being Trump as the only compelling reason to vote for them. None of this is to imply or say that it is inconsequential that Trump is now president. He is dangerous, but he is also hobbled by reality. Even though he was adept at identifying and exploiting the fears and anxiety of millions of white Americans and handfuls of other people who voted for him, he cannot deliver on his promise to make America great again. It's a promise based on a foundation of lies of what actually the problem is in the United States. Trump and his white supremacist advisors say that the U.S. is suffering from an influx of immigrants, radical Islamic terrorism, crime and violence, free trade. Much of this is racist drivel intended to stoke fear and promote scapegoating to blame the most vulnerable among us. When it comes to finding a scapegoat and stoking racism, Donald Trump is, of course, firmly operating in a long tradition of the American political establishment. It is true that free trade agreements often result in job losses for working people. But the real problem is an economic system that literally profits from driving down the wages and living standards of working people across the world. They pit workers of different nationalities against each other to convince them that the suffering of one group of workers is to the benefit of another group of workers, when in reality, the suffering of all workers is to the benefit of the rich and powerful who own the companies and corporations we are forced to work for in order to make a living in the first place. And so it can almost be guaranteed that when Trump is unable to deliver on his promises to make America great again, he and his administration will double down on racism and disorder. They will use that as a pretext to justify racism and repression. We can already see this taking shape. The executive orders dealing with immigration and law enforcement are designed to stoke fear while rapidly expanding the powers of all police and law enforcement agents. Trump wants to give local police the power of immigration control agents. He wants to increase the authority of the police. It's not necessarily intended to deport the 11 million people living in this country without papers, but it is intended to stoke fear and suspicion. It is intended to turn neighbor against neighbor, classmate against classmate, worker against worker. The expansion of policing powers of the state are also intended to lay the foundation for the repression of a growing resistance movement. The Trump administration is well aware of the opposition and resistance his administration has provoked. Just read his tweets. They have been met with unprecedented protests. The day after he was inaugurated, estimates of between 3 and 4 million people participated in protests directed at his administration in this country and around the world. In the aftermath of his illegal Muslim travel ban, tens of thousands of spontaneous protests erupted at the nation's airports. There is organizing happening in every corner of the United States. Some of it is brand new. Some of it is building on campaigns that have been underway for years now. Despite whatever lies they tell, they know their political agenda will continue to inspire protest, and so they want to create the conditions to help repress the social movements that are developing. And that means that we need larger and more effective protests. Some have asked whether or not protests or demonstrations actually matter. What can protests do? Black Lives Matter is only one example to look at when understanding the importance of protests. Police brutality was not a new issue in 2014. It was a very old issue in Black life in this country. But when the rebellion in Ferguson happened, when Mike Brown was killed in August of 2014, it drew national attention to the phenomenon of police murder and judicial misconduct. It also provided a model for communities to know how to respond to police violence through protest, activism, organizing. Protest can force open new and challenging discussions on a much broader basis while not allowing a particular issue to be swept under the rug. Black Lives Matter changed the conversation about police brutality in the United States. It provided language for people to articulate their frustration with police violence and abuse. It provided an analysis for why this violence was happening. But the Black Lives Matter movement also shows the limitations of social movements that do not advance beyond just highlighting injustice. Knowledge alone of abuse, injustice, and oppression will not actually change those conditions. Instead, mass movements of the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions have to be mobilized to stare down the autocratic impulses of the regime in the White House. We can only imagine a movement on that scale when individuals move beyond the particular issues that directly affect them, but also see the relationship or connection between all oppressions. It means organizing across movements. In other words, police brutality is not just affecting African Americans, even when it has a disproportionate effect in Black communities, but it also impacts Latino communities, immigrant communities more broadly, and certainly Arab and Muslim communities. It also means looking at how police repression has historically gone beyond their usual maintenance of racial boundaries in the United States to attacking working class white people when they begin to organize and mobilize against the status quo. People should remember in the winter and spring of 2012, before Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman, local police coordinated across the country with the FBI to physically repress the nonviolent encampments of the Occupy movement in parks and public spaces across this country. It is in everyone's interest to protest the racism and authoritarianism of the police. This is the urgency in building on the basis of solidarity and mutual understanding. And while And while it can appear as if we are a long way from that kind of struggle, when individuals are demonstrating and confronting the political status quo, they are suddenly open to new ideas and approaches that they may not have considered at an earlier time when organizing was more difficult or when an individual did not consider themselves to be political. In moments like the one we are living through now, political consciousness can develop very quickly, and people's ideas and expectations can change rapidly. For example, no one expected 3 to 4 million, mostly women, but men also, to fill the streets the day after the inauguration of Trump. But not a single person on those demonstrations across the country believed that that would be the only demonstration that they were going to be a part of in the next 4 years. Millions of people understand the threat presented by the Trump administration, and that knowledge can be turned into action and into organization. And again, it cannot be sidetracked into settling only for the election of Democrats in 2018 and 2020. We have to stop constraining our own political imagination into what is deemed pragmatic and possible. No social movement has ever begun with the question of what is realistic. Black people in the South called what we now refer to as the civil rights movement the freedom movement. When the movement did not go far enough, Black organizers in the South and North engaged in what they called the Black liberation movement. Even though these struggles included all kinds of people who had different ideas of how to achieve those goals, the point was that we have to say what it is that we want. This is especially true today, when there are those who will insist that we quiet down and be reasonable. But as the great historian Howard Zinn told us, you cannot be neutral on a moving train. So we have to fight the battles in the here and now, but we also have to fight for what we want. And that is a different kind of world altogether. Another world is possible, one free of racism, nationalism and borders, religious bigotry, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, but it is a world that has to be organized and fought for. Thank you. Thank you, guys. No, I know. I'm like, how long is the discussion? It's like, well, we can go till 9. Like, no. Okay, so hands, comments. It'd be great if some people wanted to say what they think about things, because I just talked for a long time. It might give me a few minutes to get my life together up here. I guess, are people lining up at the mic?
Are we doing that?
So yeah, free for all. Questions, comments. Yeah, maybe use the mic, I guess, because it's a large room.
Hello?
Yeah. Sure.
I wanted to ask about what we should be doing to support political dissidents. And I love the way you started this about setting a stage for provocation, about how can we defend multiculturalism and pluralism and encourage, disagreement and also withstand it, but particularly the political dissidents, the people who have spoken up, who have said the things that we're afraid to say and put themselves on the line. What should we be doing to protect them and to protect the whistleblowers and to create an environment where we encourage whistleblowers and where we can come together and support them? I'll take your answer in my seat.
Yeah. I'm going to take a few, because really I've been talking for a long time. So if you have a question, comment, or whatever, line up at the mic. Yeah.
Share what's going on campus.
Yeah, totally.
Organizing that you're doing on campus, and you want to share that. This is a great opportunity.
Well, that's exactly what I was just going to say.
Since you asked.
So there we
Yes.
go. Is that better? Okay. So I want to announce to everyone, if you really enjoyed what Keeanga has said tonight, we're having a meeting a week from tonight in Lafayette 210 at 7 o'clock called Organizing to Fight Capitalism, the Case for Socialist Organization. So, Keeanga said, we can have a world without all of these injustices, but we need to organize for it. And so this could be the first step into organizing for this world that we want. So I encourage everyone to come. You can stop by the ISO table for some flyers just for you to remember. Also, I have a question for you.
Sure.
So you talk in your book and in the talk about how an anti-racist struggle has to be an anti-capitalist struggle. Can you just speak to the history of different socialist movements internationally and where they've stood on race and the success of the different movements varying in their stance on anti-racism? If that makes sense.
Okay, that's another one I'm going to park for a minute.
Thank you.
I will get to it. Okay, yes.
Question I have, so we see millions of people protesting and demonstrating. One of the wonderful things about that is many of those people have never engaged in any kind of political activism before. So clearly we're in some kind of a new period where people are waking up on a scale we haven't seen in this country for at least 40 years.
Yeah.
We're also seeing, thousands of people are joining organizations, socialist organizations and the like. But people are also going to need a political alternative. Mm-hmm. You actually fundamentally need a political party that can actually pose an alternative to the Trump agenda. You made a powerful case about the political bankruptcy of the existing Democratic Party. How do you see, and I don't have an answer to this, how do you see us actually moving to the place where we can have a real political alternative so that people don't find that they have to once again hold their nose, if they can, in 2018 or 2020 and hope to go back to a status quo that sucked?
I think that the greatest opportunity to build a genuine third party, a party that actually represents the interest of the 99% or that represents the interest of most people exists now because there's actual struggle on the ground. And I think that that is the element that has been missing from the sort of periodic calls that go up for a third party. It's never clear exactly what that will emerge out of. And so I think that it's easy to see in some ways that the elements are there. The 13 million people voted for Bernie Sanders is one indication. I think that the kind of disappointment with the Democratic Party exists in such a way that if something organized to its left existed, that I think that there is a possibility, not that it would be supplanted. I mean, the Democratic Party has very long roots in this country and is not just going to disappear because, they screwed up an election. But I do think that out of the different political struggles, out of the growth of socialist organizations in particular, that the potential for a socialist candidate running on a socialist ticket, and perhaps out of the formation of a national, not national socialist, but a national organization of left-wing revolutionary socialists, that the potential of that actually exists now. And so to me, that is what in terms of politics and being able to participate in electoral politics so that those of us who are on the left and perhaps the radical left aren't just saying that, here's all the reasons why Democrats are not a real alternative, but not actually having something to point people to. I think that, it's much better to actually have an electoral candidate who is in the political mix that creates a platform for us to have these kinds of conversations and discussions. And I don't know the exact roadmap to getting to that point, but I do think that out of the emerging struggles around the police, around the attack on immigrant rights, around the fight against Islamophobia, around the struggles for reproductive justice and for women's rights, and for a sort of resurgence of a political feminist movement, that the constitutive elements of building a political alternative, even in the electoral realm, exist there.
I'm going to take you up on your offer to make an announcement.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for coming and being brilliant with all of us in front of us. As many people know, there's a really activated Black Lives Matter movement in Vermont. Their storefront just opened up in Winooski. It's like half a coffee shop, but it's also a community organizing space and a predominantly POC space, which there, as many of us know, are not very many of around here. So in terms of folks here who are interested in a way to really concretely get involved in our community, the shop is being run by volunteers, and we are really eager for more folks to volunteer. The shop's open like 12 hours a day, and so it takes a lot of people for a couple full-time, for that to be staffed. The email is blacklivesmattervermont@gmail.com. It's really easy to remember, so if anyone's interested in, if it's a couple hours a week, a couple hours a month, it all really helps. So email us. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Keeanga. Also, just a quick request, and that is, after you're done and during the book signing, I think that there are some United Academics faculty who we would love to have our picture taken with you so we can put it on the website and say, yay,
Yes.
we did this. With the Will Miller Social Justice Lecture Series and many other people. But a question for you, and that is, in one of the early chapters of your book, you talk about the global movements against colonialism that helped fuel the civil rights and Black power struggles here. And that, for me, raises the question about what the global context is today. Certainly we saw the incredible intersections between the Arab Spring and the Wisconsin uprising, for example, and then also Ferguson and Gaza and the overlaps and solidarity there. But I'm wondering about kind of what is the global context that that we may be both feeding into and connecting with in the struggle against racism and Trumpism. Thank you.
Well, I think that right now it's twofold. On the one hand, I think that we saw not just here an incredible outpouring of protest in response to the inauguration of Donald Trump, but in cities across the world, there were protests against Donald Trump becoming president of the United States. And I think that we've seen continued organizing in England, where Trump has been scheduled to visit England and have some big to-do there. I think the Parliament, there was a petition that was circulated to oppose Trump being able to speak to the Parliament in England, that I think that part of his visit may have been nixed, although the pomp and circumstance of hanging out with the Queen and riding around in her horse and buggy still might be happening. But, okay, that's gone too. Good. He can take the bus. So I think, that we're seeing a similar phenomenon with the Brexit vote, with the rise of the far right in Europe, obviously the election of Trump here, their relationship with each other. These people are in communication with each other and talk to each other. But I think, at the same time, it sort of confronted the left internationally with the challenge of, what kinds of movements are necessary to confront this phenomenon. And at the heart of that has been the political question and struggle over immigrants and refugees. And so that's why this question here is so critical to the movement. I think that we've also seen the potential for international solidarity around responses of Black people to police violence. And so there were Black Lives Matter protests and the formation of anti-brutality organizations in Paris, in London. There were big Black Lives Matter marches in London over the last spring. And so I think that, there are overlaps in these political phenomenon across the world, and it creates a similar reaction. But what we need is more communication and collaboration, I think, with activists here and in places around the country, around the world, that are moving into struggle around some of these questions. Next.
Hi, thanks for being here, and thanks for everything. I don't know if I have a question or an answer or anything,
Sure.
But what this makes me think about is the medium that we're using to get exposure and to communicate with each other, the different media outlets, consolidating the different controls and pressures upon them. And for instance, the past 20 years, I've noticed public radio has sanitized the diversity of voices more and more. There's a lot of corporate backing behind public radio and a lot of think tanks making their decisions in news. I grew up around Pacifica Radio in New York City area, which is not funded by corporations. It's the oldest public network in the country. So I'm thinking, like, how do people hold accountable our public airwaves more and hold feet to the fire and actually get more involved in that? And, obviously build independent networks as well. And that's, I don't know, I don't have the answer, but I'm just thinking about it, talking about this all.
Well, it's an urgent issue. As Trump has said that he's going to defund the public broadcasting, corporation? Right, yeah. In addition to the National Endowment of Arts and Humanities. But I think in terms of the media, for our side, I think one of the things that we've seen over the last couple of years is the use of the way that social media performs a critical role in getting news that might otherwise be ignored out and circulated. And so I think that is one thing. But I do think that social movements have a way, and this isn't this isn't about replacing public media, but it is to say that understanding the way that social movements can compel the mainstream media into reporting differently. And so what I mean is I think about the example of the airport protest, where if those protests had not existed, then this probably would have been reported as this executive order is handed down by fiat, it's imposed, and now there's a travel ban, and what's the next thing Trump will do? But because of the protest, it forced the stories of ordinary people into the mainstream media. And so, for example, I don't think that we would have known about a 5-year-old Iranian boy being handcuffed and detained for hours, I think, at Dulles Airport, if it had not been for the protest. And the demonstrations forced the mainstream media to look deeper into the issue and to take up the stories of individuals to, in effect, humanize what this travel ban would actually mean. And it had a tremendous impact on public opinion. Also, it had an impact on giving the judges the confidence and the political cover to actually issue stays to prevent the travel ban from being enacted. One of these judges, I think he was in Boston, said that he had never seen an outpouring around an issue like that, which is about protest. That's what the public outpouring, that's what that meant. And so the media, in order to continue to seem as if it is relevant, is forced to take up in a more complex and complicated way some of these issues when there are people in the streets. It forces them to look in a more complex way at some of these issues. So I think that's one of the things to keep in mind. And also in every social movement, new media is produced, newspapers, magazines, all sorts of ways that people create means of communication between movements to stay in touch, that sort of thing. And I think that is important as well. Others? Yep.
Hi, my name's Garrett. I'm 56 years old. I've been demonstrating since college, anti-apartheid, and I'm getting crap now for not being a good enough intersectional feminist. So what you said to me resonated so much about not being pragmatic, but I know there's a million women who've never done anything who are out here saying, I gotta do something. And I'm trying to be a bridge between my young friend in Colorado who's like, you gotta be all intersectional all the time, and these women who are like, what is feminism? But I hate Trump, right? So what do we do when we're trying to set up the left? Because I want universal health care, and like that's me, to bring in those people who are more moderate, because we need them too. We can't just be about the far left. We got to be about collaboration with the people who are just getting started.
Yep. I mean, I wrote about this issue in an article for, well, I don't remember, it was published a bunch of different places. Yeah, that was one of them. But I basically wrote about, there was all of this discussion after the January 21st march that it wasn't radical enough, and that basically it had all of these flaws, including the participation of liberals. And so, what I wrote was that's really a poor way to assess that march, because this was, a demonstration for many people. It was their first time demonstrating for literally millions of people to register their disgust with this administration, and that was an important first step. And so for people who are moving into struggle, if your response is, where have you been? It's as if the answer to that is kind of like, you should go away or you shouldn't be involved. And that is, exactly the wrong thing, I think, to be saying to people right now. I think we have to talk about how to bring people into the movement, but it also means that, we have to put forward ideas and politics about what we would like to see the movement become, and really win people to those ideas. But it's understanding that, everyone gets into organizing and politics at some point in their lives, if they do that, with all sorts of ideas. And one of the things I said in that article was that every radical began as a liberal, began as someone who just had, a basic sort of disgust with some injustice that was happening, and that was their entry point into politics. And they usually come into contact with other people who have been organizing for a little bit longer or who've had more experience. And what those people have to do is try to help, provide more experience, is to help talk about history and talk about the history of these movements and the politics of these movements. And the left and progressive movements don't just fall from the heavens fully formed. They are made up of ordinary individuals who decide that they want to take a stand around something. And if you think about, like the evolution of the civil rights movement from where it began to where it ended. I mean, in 1956, when the Montgomery Bus Boycott began in Montgomery, Alabama, the main demand of the women in the bus boycott was not the end of Jim Crow. It was, if the bus is segregated and white people are in the front and black people are in the back, then when the white section fills up, the white people cannot come to the back of the bus. Those are our seats. So the demand was basically to keep Jim Crow intact and that white people stop coming into the back of the bus. And so we go from that to the student sit-in movement of 1960 to the wave of civil disobedience and protest and mass arrests, or 20,000 people arrested in the spring of 1963, to 4 or 5 years of rebellions and uprisings in cities, more than 200 cities across this country. And so it's also that people's own experience in confronting power in the state also begins to have an impact on their politics. But I think for the initiated and the organized and people who have already figured some things out, that the point is to bring people with you and is to raise the political level of people involved and not chastise people for not figuring it out soon enough. If we're talking about building a mass movement, then it really does mean creating the political spaces where that people can ask their questions and figure these things out, but that it means that there will be a lot of people with different experiences involved, and we have to welcome that.
Keeanga, thank you very much for coming here and sharing your hopeful message. And
it's February in Vermont, and you look like you're on Venice Beach. It's incredible.
It was 60 degrees out.
I know.
And I actually moved here from Philadelphia, so I'm used to it being, summer already this time of year. So actually, the last two questions were a really good setup for what I wondered. You mentioned some really startling statistics in your talk. Sorry, this thing there. And, there's all this talk about, do we live in a post-factual world, and, Drumpf and company without a hint of irony saying fake news, and when I read in the new Jim Crow that there's more blacks under judicial control right now than were enslaved in 1860, these are like, when you think about, stats like that, it's pretty moving, but there's this whole, segment of the population that, fell for the story, and you talked about, how can we bring people over from that other side. And, I'm seeing all these attacks on the free press, and I guess I'm wondering, how do we contend with what looks to be, they're calling the media the opposition party, and this is, what is already a tool of state repression, right, the media. And so, somehow involving these other people who support this regime, into this broader movement that you're talking about. I'm just wondering if you have any specific ideas for how we deal with that. Does that make sense?
The attack on the media?
The fact that there's all this objective information out there about what's really happening, right? Like, for years I've seen that pie graph published by the federal government about their expenditures that shows like health and human services, 5% or something, But like you said, the reason that everyone is suffering economically is because of, you and not the 60% of the budget that's spent on killing civilians, across the world. So I'm wondering, how do we deal with the fact that the facts don't make it to the people? Here you have a group of people who are informed, but we need everyone to be informed, right?
I think the facts do make it to people. I think that many people, there's a understanding. I think if you've seen any of these town hall meetings, like millions of people have figured out that the Republicans threatening to get rid of I hate calling it Obamacare, but I can never remember the other name. Yes, the ACA, and not replacing it with anything, have figured that out. I think in people's own lives that most people know that it's the rich getting over. That's why people don't vote, But the real issue is whether or not you think you can do anything about it. And I think that's part of the issue. And that, again, is why the demonstrations are so important. It's not just about the initiated sort of going out and preaching to the choir and talking to each other. It's the way that protests disrupt the dominant narrative that they are trying to push. So it was insane when the airport protests are going out and you have a split screen of Trump saying, "Oh, smooth rollout. It's all going very well. All like we predicted." And then the other side of the screen is like, tens of thousands of people at American airports, which are like these no man's lands where you have no rights. Who are protesting there. And so even if you're a conservative person who, is skeptical about all this, that begins to pierce, through what they are trying to say, which is that we have a mandate, we have the will of the people behind us. The protests around the immigrants that happened last week, which was a sort of thing that just appeared to come out of nowhere, forces, again, the media to look more closely at that and to have a discussion that begins to chip away at what I call the low-hanging fruit of the Trump supporters. Those people who, thought that, well, maybe he'll shake things up and, it's a protest vote, or whatever their explanations were. The demonstrations and the discord that exists in the society is unavoidable, and it raises it begins to raise important questions about why that's happening. And so I think it's not, people often say, especially about Americans, we're all just lazy and bought off, and we all just care about our big TVs, and it's like, that's not actually what most people's lives are like. Most people are sort of living with the statistics, but they don't know what they can do about it. And so it's easy to take the sort of easy explanation that it's everyone else. That's also why you have to have an opposition and a resistance that is protesting, but is also articulating different sets of explanations for why things are happening. And it's also important to remember that we are at the very beginning of this. This man has been president for 29 days. And so we're at the very beginning, not the end. And to think about how much things have advanced, now, just in a month. Imagine how much further things will be in terms of our understanding of what is happening, of politics, of the women who came out for their first protests, a few weeks ago, when they've been on their, 5th or 20th protest a couple of years from now. And so we have to also have a longer term view of what's happening as well. All right, so I'm going to take a few more questions, and maybe I'll just take them and then maybe respond to them instead of talking every time somebody else talks.
Hi. So I have a couple of super quick announcements before I ask my question. But like Kelsey said, if you're interested in what Keeanga has to say or are inspired by this fantastic lecture, the ISO meets every Thursday at 7 in Lafayette 210 if you're interested. And this Monday, March 6th, from 6:30 to 8 p.m. in Lafayette 210 again, there's going to be a broader anti-Trump organizing meeting for anyone, whether you consider yourself a socialist or not. If you're interested in organizing against Trump, this is a great opportunity for you to do so. Also, another project that the ISO we're trying to build is to have an emergency response network built within Burlington so that when an act of oppression takes place, when someone's deported, when oppressive action happens within our community, we can be out in the streets instantly. So if you're interested in becoming a part of that network, we have a clipboard sign-up sheet on the ISO table in the back. Okay, so my question was about, I guess it was about identity politics to a certain extent. So I've heard that term a lot in the political spectrum, with Bernie Sanders bringing that up a lot, liberals. So one response that seems to come from that is saying some people like ignoring compounded oppressions by saying oh, we can't have identity politics because that's divisive. So we're all oppressed. So the compounded oppressions that you may experience don't matter because we're all oppressed. And then on the other, more positive side of that, I've been hearing a lot as a member of the ISO about the politics of solidarity. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the politics of solidarity. I know you touched on that briefly, but also I was wondering if you could speak to how, we all exist with varying degrees of privilege. So how can I, as a white ally of the Black Lives Matter movement, actively work to undermine my own privilege and work with movements like the Black Lives Matter movement within mass movements to undermine my own privilege, not just speak down to identity politics?
Okay. I see the line forming, but I'm really only going to take a couple more. So, yes.
Hi, Keeanga. Thank you so much for coming. I'm a big fan of yours. So I just want to pop the bubble of UVM real fast and point out the fact that I'm from New York City. I'm also a Bronx native and Harlem native, like Angie. And lo and behold, guess who followed me here? Del Pozo. And so I grew up, and I was a juvenile delinquent. I ran the streets because that's what I grew up in. But I wasn't stupid. I wasn't naive. I read books. I still kept informed. And so I knew that he was part of the committee that developed the stop and frisk policy. Mm-hmm. So what I'm pointing out is the fact that I want to pop this bubble that we live in and point out the fact that this is happening in Vermont. And I guess to pose the question, the answer to the young lady that just stepped in front of me is the fact that you can be doing stuff in your own community off campus, because there are policy forums happening right now about fair and policing policy that is actually directly affecting immigrants and refugees and new Americans and people of color. So you can go through those forums. So I guess the question I want to ask you, Keeanga, is can you give them more insight to, what more insight can you give to the young people who actually want to be part of the movement and check their privilege and actually do more than protesting?
Sure. Last one.
Okay. You have time for my question? Okay. I'll make it very quick.
Speak up a little bit.
Okay. My question has to do with the Democratic Party and their new alignment with the deep state. Lately, they've been talking about how the deep state is going to overthrow Trump and blah, 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 blah. Of course, anyone with any cursory history, any cursory understanding of Black history understands that any level of Black struggle is antagonistic with the deep state. What does that mean for Black Lives Matter if you have a Democratic Party that is in love with the deep state?
Okay. So do people know what this deep state business is? It's basically talking about the way that some liberals have cheered the CIA, FBI, and intelligence communities feud with Trump in hopes that some leak or some information will come out that will be the downfall of Trump, which is very problematic. I mean, you don't want to encourage the CIA, the FBI, or any of these organizations that are historically hostile to progressives, to communities of color, to immigrant populations. You don't want to encourage things that actually make them stronger and put them in a more emboldened position. And so, it is problematic that, and indicative that the Democratic Party you've seen more energy out of them in trying to arrange hearings about the role of Russia in the elections in the Trump administration than any other area of what is happening right now in this country. So just a thing about privilege. Let me just say that I think the language, I mean, this is my own personal preference and thoughts, but the language of allyship, I don't get it. I don't necessarily understand it. I think that if you're engaged in political struggle against oppression and exploitation, I think that the politics of solidarity mean that you actually have a stake in whether or not these struggles fail or succeed. And with the whole thing about being an ally makes it seem as if whether or not you get involved in struggle is an expression of altruism, that you're doing it as almost charity, and it doesn't capture. And I understand why people say it, and so I'm not hostile to people who express that, because it's usually trying to figure out how you fit into the movement, whether or not you fit into the movement. But I think that ordinary white people, middle-class white people who are politically conscious and active, have an active interest in fighting racism. And so it's not like, well, I can either not fight racism or fight racism because it has no impact on me. The best example I'd like to give for this is last year was the 20th anniversary of Bill Clinton's ending of welfare. Bill Clinton ran, President Bill Clinton ran on a pledge to end welfare as we know it. And in 1996, he signed a bill called the Personal Responsibility and Work Act. And there was a big to-do about it. He had a big signing ceremony in the Rose Garden of the White House. And at that ceremony, he was surrounded by Black women who had been on welfare. Now, what Bill Clinton knew, and what probably no one else knew, was that the majority of people on welfare at that time were white women. But he didn't surround himself with white women at that signing ceremony. He surrounded himself with black women to reinforce the stereotype that welfare was an entitlement for lazy black women who didn't want to get out and work. And so he used racism to push through that legislation, but guess who it also affected? White women and their families who were also trying to get by on welfare. And so to me, that's a tangible example of how racism can be black people's burden, but it is also white people's problem. And we have to understand that. When the United States government spends $80 billion a year to keep its prisons and its criminal justice system intact, they use racism to justify that. The black criminals, the inner cities, all the chaos going on in Chicago. They use racism to justify that. But that impacts everyone who relies on public services to have that money shifted from schools, from hospitals, from libraries into the criminal justice system. So racism is our problem. And that means that it's not a question of ally or not ally, it's a question of comrades, of people united in a common struggle to end something. And what I'll say about privilege, you know, I just think that it's a word that doesn't capture much. And in some ways, it reflects the really low and narrow expectations we've come to have in this country. So when in my talk, I said that the median income of, you know, a typical white family is $55,000 a year. Now think about that. This is the richest country on earth. 400 billionaires. You have TV shows that glorify 5,000 square foot mansions. And $55,000 is the median income. And you only think that's a lot of money if you've never tried to live on it, let alone try to raise a family on it. Now, it is also the case that the median income for black families is $35,000. Now, there's a $20,000 differential. But if you call that a privilege, having $50,000 over $35,000, in my opinion, you're missing the point. The privilege are the billionaires, are the millionaires, are the people who are actually living well because we're quibbling over $5,000, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. And it doesn't mean that that is insignificant or that those differences are real, but to talk about them as a privilege is to really miss, to me, it's to miss the point of what is actually happening in this country. And so I think what I'm talking about is about expecting more and is about demanding more and is to stop quibbling between ourselves over the crumbs that they kick off the table like garbage that they have no interest in, and we're scurrying around fighting each other for it. And it doesn't mean that we don't recognize that that there are differences and that Black life in this country is incredibly hard, that Latino life in this country has been hard and is about to get extremely harder, that life for Arabs and Muslims in this country is about to get as hard as anything that any of us can imagine. But if we keep trying to compete with each other about who has it worse, we don't take the time to figure out how do we unite on what connects us to build the largest and most effective movement to attack the people who are at the root of all of our oppression. That, to me, should be the objective. And so that's what I'll leave you with, is that we have a big challenge, and that's to figure out how to build the largest and most effective movement possible, because the things that they are talking about will absolutely destroy people's families. And so there is an urgency to figuring this out. And I encourage people to take part in that process, because it will determine what our future is. Thank you. Thank you.